So we are Micromixing and Microfluidic devices.
I'm Andrew Devine.
I'm Will.
I'm Paul Kim.
I'm Sophia.
So you might be wondering, what is microfluidic? So we'll start with a bit of history. The area of microscale devices started off in the 1960s with the invention of the integrated circuit. Devices such as the microchip for computer use came into use. Afterwards, in the year 1980, we began to see the first microfluidic devices. Now, these tiny devices spurred the use of the term lab on a chip. It was the idea that you can fit most of the processes found in a normal life-size laboratory and fit them on a small compact chip. Now, this had vast implications on the fields of biomedical, genetic, and pharmaceutical sciences. Now, you might be wondering, why does this help? Why does working in the microscope benefit? Well, first of all, it allows us to take away a lot of the human error from normal lab processes. Things like contamination of fluids, errors in measurement, and just general laziness. Now, of course, there are also errors that come with working in the microscope, which we'll address later. Overall, we thought that the benefits of working with microfluidics far outweigh their costs. Also, when working within the microscale, a little goes a long way. Just a single drop of blood can fill an entire microfluidic device. This allows you a lot more options when working with experiments in areas such as genetics. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, it's cheap. After you've created your design and created your mold, it takes us a few dollars to create a whole bunch of microfluidic devices. This allows you to have an enormous amount of experiments that you couldn't really do in a normal lab, just due to cost and efficiency. So what are we doing? The model on the top left shows the standard microfluidic device. The cylinders on the top and bottom show the inlets and outlets. Our designs are actually a bit simpler than this. We'll show you these later on in the presentation. It's important to notice the differences in mixing when it comes to the microscale. We can't physically mix these fluids because it's too small. So instead, we have to flow them together and wait till they diffuse. Diffusion is the movement of particles from areas of high density to areas of low density. So what we do in this experiment is we take two fluids at different colors and we let them flow together until they diffuse into one solid color. Our overall goal is to analyze the properties of mixing within a microfluidic device, and then using these properties to determine which device is most space efficient, which device can mix best while taking up the least amount of space. So our process is split into 4 parts. First, we have to create the device. We didn't actually create the mold because it's too expensive and time-consuming, but we did every other step. Afterwards, we have to run the device and actually see the diffusion take place. At certain points of the diffusion, we would take images and run these images through a program called ImageJ. Afterwards, we would take these results and determine which device is the most efficient.
So what exactly are these microfluidic devices? We use a process called soft lithography to combine something called polydimethylsiloxane, which we call PDMS for short oxidase. And we combine it with silicon elastomer to create a substance that once it's set in the oven, it's flexible enough to work with, but yet it's still sturdy enough to maintain its own body. And of course, we are trying to establish this lab-on-a-chip procedure so that we eliminate as much human error as possible. But in our procedures, in creating the PDMS, we still have to be careful so that nothing gets in the way of the channels. So we put the PDMS in a vacuum to remove all the air bubbles, because as you can see in this image here, the PDMS rests on top of the master mold and creates channels. If there are air bubbles there, it'll interfere with the channels and completely render the device useless. Once it's removed all the air bubbles, you can put it in the oven, and then that sets, and we wash it to remove all the debris, which also can interfere with the channels. And we bind the PDMS electrically with a Tesla coil to a sheet of glass, and it looks like this. It's very small, as you can see, because we're working on the For our experiment, we chose 3 devices that follow logical flow, from simple to more complex. The first one on the top you can see is just a straight channel, 3 centimeters long. It's the base of our experiment to show the diffusion just across one channel. And our second one incorporates a long channel with more turns, so it becomes more complex. And the third one has even more turns. You can see we did 2 trials each for each of the 3 devices. The first trial used a flow rate of 5 microliters per minute, and the second one used a flow rate of 10. And this is to examine not only the geometry of the channels themselves, but also to see the effects of different fluids. So we took these devices and we ran them under light microscopes at 20 times magnification, and we used green food dye and distilled water to differentiate between the two fluids, which I'll show you later in later images. And we used camera software to analyze these images. This is our lab setup. At the top left, we have syringe pumps that pump the green dye and the distilled water through the device. In the middle there, that's the device itself on the microscope stage. And on the bottom right is the software that we have to analyze. And these are just some of the images that we took. At the top there, we have device 1, we have the inlet and the outlet. At the beginning, you can see that the line is very clear, which shows that the green dye and the distilled water are separate. But at the end of those 3 centimeters, it's already begun to blur, which shows the diffusion of the two fluids. Device 2 and device 3 show the long channels as they go across. So again, you can see that it's very distinct at the interface, but then as it goes along, it becomes more diffused.
So after imaging, we analyzed our pictures using a program called ImageJ. ImageJ allows us to take the pixel intensity and use it as a measure of concentration gradient. So using this program, we were able to calibrate it based on the minimum and maximum gradient values, so that we get a nice scale of 0 to 1 that will work well with our calculations. After calibrating it, we can measure the mixing index, which I'll go into later, as well as pixel intensity. We then used a series of equations called Fick's law of diffusion, which allowed us to find the time taken at each image point. So what is mixing index? Mixing index is basically the standard deviation of concentration. We can represent this by taking the standard deviation of pixel intensity. And using these values, as well as the parameters measured by ImageJ, we can compare it and find some nice trends. So in the first graph on the top left, we can see mixing index versus channeling. What we found was that as fluids travel through a device, the mixing index decreases. On the second graph, it plots the mixing index versus time. So as you spend more time in the device, the mixing index once again decreases. These graphs are representative of device 1, the straight channel. However, despite the negative slope, it actually did diffuse all the way. The mixing index value for device 1 was only 0.3 at the lowest. However, if you look at devices 2 and 3, you can see that they reach a mixing index value of 0.1. For mixing index values, we want a lower value so that it shows that it's more diffused, as opposed to a greater value, which means that it's different. So you can see here that we also use a linear regression, because in devices 2 and 3, we actually reach diffusion prior to the end of the device. Another way of looking at diffusion is to observe the pixel intensity. Pixel intensity is basically the gradient values across the channel width, so down the vertical of the channel. And what we found was that as you go further, the pixel intensity changes near the outlet. So in the left image, we have T1, which is representative of the image directly after the inlet. You can see there are 2 distinct colors, which represent the 2 different fluids. If you look at the second image on the right, you can see that it is completely one color, meaning that it is completely diffused. And this just using these kind of pixel intensity graphs, we can determine how well the progress of diffusion over the channel length. So through this, we can do some geometry analysis of the features. We found that turns aid in diffusion. Turns allow for greater dispersion of the fluid molecules and changes the momentum, which decreases the resistance to mixing. We also found that more time in the device is better. Something that's directly correlating to this is the longer channel length. The longer channel length, like device 2, which had channel length of 57 centimeters, had reached a very low mixing index value. We also found that the effect of flow rate really depends on geometry, like how many turns you have and how long your channels are. So in conclusion, if you were to propose a better device or a better design, you would encourage more turns and more channels.
However, we have all this performance data about micromixers, but that tells us nothing about their actual space efficiency. Now, there's no real good way to define space efficiency because it means different things in different contexts. But we've developed a simple space efficiency ratio here, which is quite simply the derivative of the mixing index with respect to channel length over the total area of the device, including any wasted space. And this is important because it affects something in our conclusions. So, what we found, in terms of actual math, the straight channel is the most space-efficient device. However, this is because it has no wasted space. You might have noticed earlier that it didn't reach complete diffusion though. In order for a straight channel to reach complete diffusion, it would need to be very long. And you probably couldn't really call it a micro device if you had a 12-inch long channel. So, for practical purposes, it's actually the long channel serpentine, the second device, that 57 centimeter long channel, that is most space efficient. And this makes sense because it has a much higher channel density compared to the device 3, which had a lot more wasted space in between the channels. So we felt it was necessary to go over some of the errors in the experiment because they have important implications for the field of microfluidics. Some of the error came from our statistical process. We used linear regression to model the change in mixing index over length and over time, but this wasn't necessarily always the trend. Sometimes we observed a slightly steeper trend in some places, and that we figured was due to the turns. But it provided an overall generally good modeling.
Most of our physical errors came from incorrect bonding of the PDMS to black. If we incorrectly bond the PDMS, then it leads to leaks and bubbles inside the channel. Now, most of our imaging errors came from incorrect casting. When we cast PDMS, it has to be completely flat. If we cast it on a slope, then when you put it under the microscope, you're focusing on a slope. And what that makes you have to do is constantly adjust the focus. Now, since we're analyzing images of the microscope, the focus, if I keep on changing the focus, it might not be the same each time. Now, these different photos would lead to different results when it comes time for Paul or Andrew to analyze these images.
So, in conclusion, we found that high channel density is the most important factor in making a space-efficient micromixer device. We also found, as a result, as a side effect of doing this process, that the kind of image analysis we were doing on these microfluidics, while it was useful and easy to set up, it was not very accurate or precise. And finally, due to many headaches we had in actually setting up the device, we think that a better material than PDMS or a better manufacturing process for these PDMS devices needs to be made in order for wide-scale adoption to occur. Here are our citations in case you care, which you probably don't, so. I'd like to thank Dr. Zong, Rohit, and Jean, as well as the GSET counselors and the GSET administrators and all sponsors of the Governor's School. Any questions?